I didn't attend my brother's surprise birthday party for this reason. I am currently living with my partner and two children. My younger brother recently had a milestone birthday, and my parents decided to throw him a surprise party. Normally, it'd be all for it, but here's where things get complicated. A week before the event, my mom casually mentions that they've planned the surprise party at my house because it's more spacious and centrally located for everyone else. This was the first I'd heard of it, and they hadn't asked for my permission beforehand. I was immediately overwhelmed because my partner has been recovering from surgery and our house is hardly in a state for hosting. I told my mom that hosting wasn't possible and suggested a few alternative venues. She got upset and said everything was already arranged and changing locations last minute would be too complicated. Feeling cornered, I stood my ground and said they needed to relocate the party or scale it down. The fallout was immediate. My brother, who was accidentally clued in, called me selfish for not accommodating the family on his special day. My parents accused me of ruining what could have been a perfect family gathering. In the end, they hastily rearranged the event at a cousin's place, but the atmosphere was strained, and several relatives made passive-aggressive comments about my absence. The days following the party were emotionally draining. I received a string of messages from family members, some expressing disappointment, others outright chastising me for what they saw as a lack of family spirit. My partner, seeing how much the situation was affecting me, tried to reassure me that I did the right thing by prioritizing our immediate household. Still, the guilt weighed heavily. A week later, my dad called me to talk things over. I hoped it might be an opportunity to clear the air, but it quickly turned into a lecture about family obligations and how I should have stepped up for my brother's milestone. He also brought up past occasions where he felt I hadn't been present enough for family events, painting a picture of me as the distant, uncooperative sibling. The call left me in tears and questioning whether I had handled things the right way. Meanwhile, my brother's milestone birthday became a recurring topic of conversation in family group chats. Pictures from the party were shared, my parents laughing, my brother cutting a cake with 30 candles, and relatives posing happily in my cousin's decorated living room. The narrative seemed to focus on how wonderful the celebration was, despite the hiccups leading up to it. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become the unspoken villain of the story. Adding to the tension, my cousin, who had ultimately hosted the event, started dropping hints in conversations about how accommodating she'd been, implying that hosting should have been my responsibility. It wasn't ideal, but we made it work, she'd say with a knowing smile. It stung, especially since I'd never agreed to host in the first place. In the midst of all this, my partner's recovery hit a rough patch. The stress of the situation made it harder for them to heal, and I felt torn between being their support system and trying to repair the growing rift with my family. My kids, too, picked up on the tension. My eldest, who's only 10, asked why Grandma seemed upset with me, forcing me to give a watered-down explanation about misunderstandings and family disagreements. Eventually, I decided to take a step back and reevaluate my relationship with my family. I realized that this wasn't the first time it felt cornered or pressured into meeting their expectations at the expense of my own boundaries. There had been countless smaller instances over the years where it agreed to things I wasn't comfortable with just to keep the peace. This time, however, the stakes felt higher because it wasn't just about me, it was about protecting my household. As I mulled over my next steps, my mom unexpectedly showed up at my doorstep one afternoon. She looked tired but determined, and I braced myself for another confrontation. Instead, she surprised me by apologizing for assuming I'd host without asking. "I didn't think about how much you have on your plate right now," she admitted, though her tone suggested she still believed I could have made it work. We talked for a long time that day. While her apology felt genuine, there was an underlying expectation that I should have communicated my refusal more tactfully. She suggested that part of the blame lay in my abrupt way of handling things, which she felt had escalated the situation unnecessarily. I countered by explaining how her lack of communication had left me feeling blindsided and overwhelmed. By the end of the conversation, we had reached a fragile truce, but the unresolved tension lingered. The family dynamics didn't magically improve after that. My brother remained distant, and some relatives continued to bring up the party whenever we spoke, as if to remind me of my perceived failings. Yet, I also began to see small glimmers of support from unexpected places. My aunt, who'd largely stayed out of the drama, called to say she understood why I'd put my foot down. "Sometimes you have to prioritize what's right for you and your family," she said. Her words felt like a lifeline amid the sea of criticism. Despite these small moments of reassurance, the larger issues with my family remained unresolved. As weeks turned into months, the party incident became less of a hot topic, but still cast a shadow over family interactions. I started to wonder if this was the beginning of a larger reckoning within our family, a moment that had brought underlying tensions to the surface. If so, what would it mean for our relationships moving forward? The question lingered in my mind as I navigated the delicate balance between maintaining family ties and setting boundaries. It felt like a tightrope walk with no clear destination in sight. In the weeks that followed the fragile truce with my mother, life felt like it was moving in two separate streams. On one side, I tried to focus on my immediate family, supporting my partner through their recovery and ensuring my kids felt secure amidst the underlying tension. On the other, the dynamics with my extended family simmered, unresolved and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The passive-aggressive comments hadn't entirely stopped. My brother remained curt and distant in our limited interactions, his tone carrying an edge of resentment. My parents, while outwardly civil, still slipped in remarks about family unity or what it means to support each other. These statements felt less like words of wisdom and more like pointed jabs, reminders of their disappointment. One evening, as I was tucking my youngest into bed, my phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat. My cousin, the one who had hosted the party, had shared a series of photos from yet another gathering, this time a casual barbecue. As I scrolled through the images, I noticed that nearly every family member was there, including my parents and brother. The caption read, "Nothing better than family time. Wish everyone could be here." The absence of my name wasn't subtle. I hadn't even known about the barbecue, and the deliberate exclusion stung more than I cared to admit. Part of me wanted to call my cousin and confront her, but another part felt exhausted by the prospect of yet another conflict. Instead, I put my phone down and sat in silence, trying to suppress the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. The next day, my aunt, the one who had expressed understanding after the party incident, called me out of the blue. "I noticed you weren't at the barbecue yesterday," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Were you invited?" Her question confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. My exclusion was intentional. I told her I hadn't been invited and tried to downplay it, but she wasn't fooled. "That's not right," she said firmly. "You shouldn't be treated this way, especially over something as minor as hosting a party." Her words were a balm to my wounded pride, but they also stirred a deeper sense of frustration. Why was this still such a significant issue? Why couldn't my family move past it? The questions churned in my mind as I went about my day, their weight growing heavier with each passing hour. A few days later, my mom called again. This time, her tone was different, less accusatory, more conciliatory. "Your father and I have been talking," she began, and my stomach tightened. "We think it might be a good idea to have a family meeting. To clear the air." The suggestion caught me off guard. A family meeting? It sounded formal, almost clinical, and I couldn't imagine how it would play out. Still, there was a part of me that yearned for resolution, even if it came through uncomfortable confrontation. "Okay," I said cautiously, "but only if everyone agrees to actually listen to each other. I'm not going to sit through an hour of people pointing fingers." Of course, my mom assured me, though her voice carried a note of hesitation. "Well, make sure it's a productive conversation." The date was set for the following weekend, and as it approached, I found myself oscillating between anxiety and hope. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I needed to prepare. My partner, ever supportive despite their ongoing recovery, helped me outline the key points I wanted to address. The lack of communication, the importance of respecting boundaries, and the need for mutual understanding. When the day arrived, we gathered at my parents' house. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. My brother sat with his arms crossed, his expression guarded. My cousin, the impromptu party host, avoided eye contact. My parents wore matching looks of apprehension, as if they were bracing for impact. My mom opened the meeting with a brief acknowledgement of the tension within the family. "We're here because we love each other," she began, "and we want to move forward. But we need to address what happened and how it's affected everyone." I appreciated her effort to set a constructive tone, but the conversation quickly veered off course. My brother was the first to speak, his voice sharp as he listed all the ways he felt it let him down. "It wasn't just about the party," he said. "You've been pulling away for years." This was just the tipping point. His words felt like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said evenly, "but I've never intentionally distanced myself. I've been trying to balance my responsibilities at home with being part of this family. Sometimes that means I can't show up in the way you'd like." My cousin chimed in next, her tone defensive. "I'm not saying you were wrong to set boundaries," she said, "but the way you handled it made things harder for everyone. If you'd just explained earlier, maybe we could have avoided all this." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I understand that it was frustrating for plans to change last minute, but I wasn't given a choice. The party was decided without my input, and by the time I found out, I was already overwhelmed. I'm not saying I handled it perfectly, but I'm asking you to see it from my perspective. The conversation ebbed and flowed, emotions running high as each person aired their grievances. There were moments of understanding, but also moments of stubbornness, where it felt like we were talking past each other instead of to each other. By the end of the meeting, we hadn't reached a resolution, but there was a sense that the first steps had been taken. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the complexities of family relationships. They're messy, imperfect, and often fraught with misunderstandings. But they're also resilient, capable of withstanding conflict and finding a way forward, even if the path isn't always clear. Back at home, my partner greeted me with a warm hug. "How did it go?" they asked gently. "It's a start," I said, leaning into their embrace. "A messy, complicated start." Despite the lingering tension, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would require patience, understanding, and perhaps more difficult conversations. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a small light in the midst of the storm. The aftermath of the family meeting left me in a strange emotional limbo. While the conversation had been a step toward addressing the deeper issues, it also unearthed layers of resentment and misunderstandings that had been buried for years. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the meeting in my head, analyzing each interaction and trying to make sense of where things stood. My brother's accusations lingered the most. His words had cut deeper than I wanted to admit, and the idea that he saw me as distant felt both unfair and unsettling. We had shared so much growing up, yet here we were, almost strangers navigating a minefield of unmet expectations. I wanted to reach out to him to bridge the gap, but I wasn't sure how to start. Meanwhile, my parents seemed to be walking on eggshells around me. My mom called a few times to check in, her voice carefully neutral as she asked about my partner's recovery and the kids. My dad, on the other hand, remained distant. Had said little during the family meeting, but his silence had been heavy with disapproval. I could feel it in the way he avoided direct eye contact and the clipped tone of his words. Then there was my cousin. Her defensiveness during the meeting had felt like a betrayal, and I struggled to reconcile it with the person I had once considered a confidant. We had always been close, sharing inside jokes and leaning on each other during tough times. But now her actions felt calculated, as if she were positioning herself as the family's savior at my expense. It hurt more than I cared to admit. Despite the emotional weight of these relationships, life continued to move forward. My partner's recovery progressed slowly but steadily, and the kids brought moments of joy that reminded me of what truly mattered. Still, the unresolved tension with my family hovered like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as I was cleaning up after lunch, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. "Can we talk?" It read. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Did he want to mend fences, or was this another opportunity for him to air his grievances? Finally, I typed back, "Sure, when?" We agreed to meet at a local coffee shop the following evening. The prospect of facing him filled me with a mix of anxiety and hope. I spent the rest of the day mentally preparing, rehearsing what I might say, and bracing myself for whatever he might throw my way. When I arrived at the coffee shop, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, standing awkwardly before sitting back down. "Hey," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. For a moment, we sat in silence, the hum of conversation around us filling the void. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "and I realized that maybe I wasn't being fair to you." His admission caught me off guard. I had braced myself for defensiveness or anger, not this unexpected vulnerability. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "I've been thinking about it too, and I know I could have handled things better, but it felt like I didn't have a choice in the matter." He nodded, looking down at his coffee. "I guess I didn't really think about what you were dealing with. I was so caught up in my own expectations that I didn't consider how unfair it was to put all that on you." The tension between us began to ease as we talked. We revisited the party incident, each of us sharing our perspectives and acknowledging where things had gone wrong. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt like a step toward healing. By the time we parted ways, there was a sense of tentative understanding between us, a fragile bridge being built over the chasm that had formed. While my brother and I were making progress, the situation with my parents remained more complicated. My dad's silence weighed on me, and I knew that if we didn't address it soon, the distance between us would only grow. But every time I thought about reaching out, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face his disappointment head-on. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, my dad showed up unannounced. I found him standing on the porch, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. We sat in the living room, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've been thinking about the meeting," he began, his voice low, "and I realized that maybe I haven't been as supportive as I should have been." His admission surprised me. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I've always expected a lot from you," he said. "Maybe too much. And when you said no to hosting the party, it felt like you were pushing us away. But I see now that I wasn't looking at the bigger picture." His words brought a lump to my throat. "I've never wanted to push anyone away," I said softly, "but sometimes I feel like I'm not allowed to have boundaries without being seen as selfish." We talked late into the night, delving into years of unspoken expectations and misunderstandings. It was a raw, emotional conversation, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my dad was truly listening to me. As he left that night, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. We hadn't solved everything, but we had taken a significant step forward. Yet, even as I felt the beginnings of healing with my dad and brother, I knew that the broader family dynamics were still unresolved. The wounds ran deep, and it would take more than a few conversations to mend them. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about the future. What would it take to rebuild trust and understanding within my family? Could we ever truly move past the hurt and resentment, or were we destined to remain fragmented? The questions loomed large, their answers uncertain, as I continued navigating the delicate balance between hope and reality. In the months that followed my dad's unexpected visit, the dynamics within my family slowly began to shift. The conversations I had with my dad and brother laid the foundation for something new, not perfect, but real. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a starting point, and that was enough for me to hold on to. My brother and I continued to rebuild our relationship one step at a time. We started small, exchanging texts about everyday things, work, his hobbies, and updates about the kids. Over time, those conversations grew more meaningful. He even visited our home one afternoon, bringing a small gift for my partner as a gesture of goodwill. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that he was trying, and I appreciated it more than I could say. My dad also made an effort to bridge the gap. He called more often, not to lecture, but to genuinely ask how things were going. He listened when I spoke about the challenges of juggling my responsibilities, and for the first time, I felt like he saw me as a person, not just as his daughter. One evening, he even apologized for the way he had handled things during the party incident. "I'm sorry if I made you feel like your feelings didn't matter," he said. "That was never my intention." Those words meant everything to me. They didn't erase the hurt, but they showed me that he was willing to take responsibility. and that was enough to start mending the wounds. While my relationship with my immediate family improved, the broader family dynamics remained complicated. My cousin, who had hosted the party, continued to be a source of tension. Her subtle remarks and thinly veiled criticism lingered, making every interaction with her feel like a test of patience. At first, I tried to engage, to explain my side of things yet again, but I quickly realized that her perspective wasn't likely to change. She thrived on the role of mediator and savior, and no amount of reasoning would convince her otherwise. Instead of trying to win her approval, I decided to let go. I stopped engaging in arguments and focused on maintaining a polite but distant relationship. It wasn't ideal, but it was what I needed to protect my peace. My mom remained the most challenging to navigate. While she had apologized for assuming to host the party, her actions often contradicted her words. She would occasionally bring up the incident in conversations, framing it as a lesson in family compromise. It frustrated me, but I reminded myself that change takes time, and people don't always grow at the pace we want them to. I set firm boundaries, gently but clearly, whenever she crossed the line. The real turning point came during a family gathering a few months later. It was a casual dinner at my parents' house with most of the extended family present. I had been hesitant to attend, worried that the atmosphere would be tense, but my brother had encouraged me to go. "It's time," he said. "Let's show them that we can move forward." Walking into that house felt like stepping into the lion's den, but I was determined to hold my head high. The evening started off awkwardly, with polite small talk and forced smiles. My cousin's attempts to dominate the conversation were met with weary tolerance from most of the family, and my mom flitted around the room, trying to keep everyone happy. As the night went on, something surprising happened. My aunt, the one who had supported me after the party incident, spoke up. "You know," she said, addressing the room, "we've all made mistakes, but I think it's time we stop holding on to grudges. Family is supposed to be about love and forgiveness, not judgment." Her words seemed to shift the energy in the room. My dad nodded in agreement, and even my mom looked thoughtful. My cousin remained silent, but I noticed her fidgeting uncomfortably, as if unsure how to respond. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of unity within the family, however fragile it might be. Toward the end of the evening, my dad pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "for standing your ground and for being here tonight. It means a lot." His words brought tears to my eyes, but I blinked them away, not wanting to draw attention to myself. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "That means a lot to me too." As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The wounds from the party incident weren't completely healed, and they might never be, but I realized that closure doesn't always mean perfection. Sometimes it means finding peace in the imperfections, accepting that relationships are messy and complicated, but worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, I continued to focus on my immediate family. My partner's recovery reached a new milestone, and the kids flourished in the stable, loving environment we had worked so hard to create. The tensions with my extended family gradually faded into the background, no longer the all-consuming presence they had once been. Looking back, I saw the party incident not as a breaking point, but as a turning point. It forced me to confront long-standing issues within my family and to advocate for myself in ways I never had before. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without pain, but it led to growth, both within myself and within my relationships. And so, as I stood on the porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of calm that had eluded me for so long. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clearer sky and a stronger foundation. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was finally at peace with that.